Thank you. Well, great honor to be invited to speak to you tonight. I'd like to thank NYHRE for this, of course. Thank you, Simone, for your introduction and your collaboration. And I also want to acknowledge two people, one of whom you've already seen tonight, Liz Evans, who introduced the proceedings. Liz and her partner, Mark, actually founded the organization, the Portland Hotel Society, where I had the privilege of working as a physician for 12 years. This is in Vancouver's downtown east side, and for those of you that don't know, Vancouver's east side, downtown east side, is ground zero for addiction in North America. We have more people there in a few square block radius dependent on injectable, inhalable, ingestible substances than anywhere on the continent. Liz was a street nurse who found that ministering to people in the streets required more than just handing out medicines and putting bandages on wounds. These people needed housing, needed nutrition, needed decent care. So she and others, and including her partner, Mark Townsend, who's here tonight as well, founded the Portland Hotel Society, the first year of which ran on a shoestring budget of $15,000. It is now a $33 million a year annual enterprise. Life has moved on, and Liz and Mark have moved on. They've come to New York, and I just want to tell you guys that New York's gain is certainly Vancouver's loss. So, and everything I know about harm reduction, in fact, my very introduction to the topic came because of their work. So thank you both. So now, you know, NYHRE is a harm reduction organization. What is harm reduction? I think Dimitri's comment in the film illustrated it or summarized it better than any other words could. He said that harm reduction is all about love. And in other words, it's not a technique. It's not a set of practices. What it actually is, it's an attitude, it's an approach, it's a way of being. People have a hard time grasping that. Obviously, handing out clean needles is an important service, and it's a harm reduction service. But it's much more than that. It's much more than that. Because implied in that act of handing out a clean needle is an attitude that says that we accept you exactly as the where you are right now, and we're going to support you exactly where you are in life right now. Now that, as I'll be telling you, is an attitude that addicted people have rarely ever in their lives received. In fact, had they received it in the first place, they would not be addicted in the second place. So the harm reduction approach speaks to the very heart of what addiction is all about and what the real humane treatment of addiction should be all about. Now the attitude, and I'm going to say something else, which is that we usually think of harm reduction as reducing the harm from addiction to the client. For example, again, providing sterile water for people to inject with is better than seeing them use puddled water from the back alleys. So that the harm reduction measure reduces the harm of the addictive behavior of the substance use. But it does much more than that. And much more fundamentally, it reduces the tremendous harm that social attitude towards substance users impose on substance users. Because the greatest harm is not from the addictive use of substances, it's from the social attitudes and social policies and legal policies towards users. That is the greatest source of harm. And harm reduction subverts that in a very, very healthy way. Now, when the first and until recently only supervised injection site in North America opened up, called Insight in Vancouver, the head of Canada's federal police, not the head, but the spokesperson for Canada's federal police, the RCMP, stated that the practice of resuscitating overdosed users sends the wrong message. because it sends the message that it's okay to be addicted. I had no problem with that particular statement, so long as we were willing to be consistent about it. So I thought next time a workaholic, smoking, type A personality, hard driving, rageaholic business executive shows up at the emergency ward with a heart attack, they should kick him right out instead of giving bypass surgery and resuscitation and whatever else it requires, because he brought it on himself, right? So treating such people is creating the wrong message, which also means, of course, that diabetics who ate too much sugar should not be given insulin. People who go skiing, knowing the risks of a leg fracture, should not be given orthopedic surgery. And all around, let's just forget about healthcare altogether. If we're going to be consistent about the right message. But if we're not going to do that, we need to ask ourselves very carefully, why is it that we single out users for special opprobrium and special neglect and special ostracization? And that's because the attitudes towards substance use in this country and in this continent, and actually throughout much of the world, is retrograde and utterly without comprehension, without science, and without compassion. So harm reduction, again, reduces the harm of all that on substance users. Now, why is it that people use substances anyway? Now, as you know, right now, there's an epidemic of opioid overdoses. People are overdosing with opiate drugs, very often laced with a very powerful opiate called fentanyl. And fentanyl is something I was quite familiar with when I was working in palliative care, looking after terminally ill people, because it's much more powerful than morphine. It's about 100 times as strong. So it's a tremendously powerful pain reliever, which also means it has very little margin for error. So the difference between the dose that'll give you what you're looking for in terms of relief of stress or pain and the dose that'll kill you is very little compared to, say, morphine. Now, currently in the United States, there are about 120 to 140 deaths every day from overdoses, which means to say that in this country, every month, you're experiencing the equivalent of a 9/11 in terms of number of people dying. So it's not one 9/11, it's a 9/11 every month. Where is the public alarm? Where is the mounting of government resources? Where is the social concern? Where is the media coverage to comparing this particular devastation with that singular event? Or to take an example maybe a bit more fair, if you like, let's look at the so-called SARS epidemic, or the SARS so-called epidemic that happened a few years ago, where the newspapers were rife with stories every day. The TV couldn't get enough of it. Healthcare costs were devoted to it in large amounts. Governmental mobilization was immense over a so-called epidemic that killed very few people. Well, what's the difference? The difference is nothing but one of attitude, one of a real bizarre discrepancy between who we think important and who we don't think important. The people that got that SARS, who contacted SARS, were nice, middle-class Caucasian people, for the most part, who traveled, not the denizens of the poor areas of North America, and not people driven to desperation by their life histories. So whereas it had not even a small percentage of the impact that this epidemic does, it got a lot more attention and many more resources dedicated to its eradication and alleviation. So there's a tremendous discrepancy between a contradiction in how we treat one condition and another. And it's not the only one. It's not the only contradiction. It's not the only discrepancy. Take the discrepancy of the illegality of the substances themselves. So take heroin, which compared to another substance like cigarette smoke, you can't compare the two. If you take 1,000 people who shoot heroin 3 or 4 times a day in a non-overdose quantity, and you take 1,000 people who smoke a pack of cigarettes every day, at the end of 30 years, if you look at the two groups, the smoking group will have infinitely more deaths, disease, misery. And yet, the one substance is legal, sold in corner stores. The other, it can't even be given by prescription. For what reason? It's totally arbitrary. And what characterizes attitudes towards addiction and substance use is utter arbitrariness. Some substances that kill many more people than the illegal substances are advertised on television, such as beer, for example. Whereas you're caught for the possession of a small amount of cocaine if you go to jail. That's another example of the arbitrariness of social attitudes and the harm that they cause. Furthermore, if you just look at cocaine itself, if you possess a certain kind of cocaine, you're going to get 5 times as much jail time as if you possess another kind of cocaine. For example, if you possess crack cocaine, your criminal conviction carries greater penalty than if you possess the same amount of pure cocaine. And by the way, when I say it's 5 times as much, this is a big improvement over 15 times as much as used to be the case. It so happens that the people that can afford pure powder cocaine happen to be generally wealthier and more Caucasian. So this arbitrariness is nothing but a race-based, one more example of discrimination. And then we distinguish between substance users, and we call them addicts, and a whole bunch of other people that are just as addicted and whose addictions are just as harmful, in fact, to society, much more harmful, and they're respectable people. Because let's just define addiction here for a minute. What is addiction? An addiction is a process that is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or reward in, craves, causes negative consequences to herself, himself, or others, and does not give up. That's what an addiction is. Now, that has nothing to do with substances. It may be substance-based, obviously. Crystal meth, cocaine, heroin, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol. It could also be shopping. It could also be gambling. It could also be work. It could also be an addiction to power and to profit. And it has the same features, as I'll be telling you if I have time. It employs the same brain circuits. And yet certain types are acceptable and even respectable, and others are demeaned and despised. And if you ask the question, which addiction, which attachment, which compulsive pursuit of something causes more harm in this world? Is it the addiction, compulsion, and pursuit of profit, or is it heroin? You can't even compare the two. And yet the one is okay and even respectable. The other, same kind of behavior, is to be ostracized. Now, why is that? It's because the social view of addiction is that this is something terrible that people do by choice. People are choosing to do this. That's the belief. If people weren't choosing to do it, that would knock the very ground out of the criminal justice system. Because the very assumption in a court is that somebody has deliberately engaged in a behavior. If that wasn't the case, what are we punishing them for? So the criminal justice system is based entirely on the principle that substance use and substance addiction, substance dependence is a behavior of choice. And when I say the criminal justice system, That's exactly what it is. It's a criminal justice system. Because criminality has to do with... Criminality is when you're hurting people who don't deserve, who don't merit being hurt for your own reasons and for your own profit. That's what criminality is. It's a criminal justice system because it hurts people with no justification who don't deserve to be hurt for the benefit of others. That's the one belief, that it's a choice. Now the other belief is that addiction is a disease of the brain. So the American Surgeon General, Vice Admiral Murthy, published a report in November which basically says that addiction is a disease of the brain, and which is, by the way, is a step forward, because it was the first time that any official American government publication or institution acknowledged that addiction wasn't a choice. So that's a step forward. And it's a brain disease. Well, if it's a brain disease, at least you're not blaming people for the disease, and you're going to treat them, and you're not going to blame them when they relapse any more than you blame somebody for relapsing with cancer or rheumatoid arthritis. So from that perspective, it's a much more humane perspective than the choice hypothesis. But it shares something in common with the choice hypothesis. Even though they're not similar at all, there's something that they share. Because if you read the Vice Admiral's report, it says that addiction is about 50 to 70%, in other words, vastly, largely driven by genetic inheritance. And if something is driven by genetic inheritance, at least you're not blaming the person, but you're also not doing something else. You're not looking at the factors in society, in the culture, in economics, and in people's actual lives that promote or drive addiction. And as a writer in the New York Times said, in another context, speaking of a genetic perspective, he said, it's all in the genes and is an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy and engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation in the world? It can't be the system. It must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. In other words, the genetic idea, although it's less punitive and more humane than the choice idea, still comfortably allows us to ignore all the social factors and personal history and environmental conditions that actually drive addiction. And that would be okay if it was accurate. So the Admiral's report says that addiction is about 50 to 70%. Well, it's not even 5 or 7% if you look at the science. So I'd go for it, even though it was socially conservative. I'd accept it if it was accurate, but it isn't. That's not what addiction is about at all. It's not about genes. It's not about inheritance. None of that stuff. And it's certainly not about choice. What is it about? Well, let's just do an experiment here. I can't see you very well, but I'm going to ask you a question. So I've defined addiction for you. Any behavior, it's manifested in any behavior that a person craves because they find pleasure or temporary relief in it, experiences negative consequences, can't give it up despite the negative consequences. That's what an addiction is. Would you raise your hand if ever in your life ever had an addiction in your life at all? Ever? Okay? I don't care what, when, or what to. Okay? Thank you. Now, let me just ask some of you in the front that I can hear. Just raise your hand and then over to you. Not what was wrong with it. Not what the harm that it did. You already know that. But what did you like about it? What did it do for you in the short term? Okay? Anybody?
Peace.
Sorry?
Peace.
Peace. A sense of peace. Terrific. Anybody else?
Made me feel good.
You made you feel good, which is to say, okay, good. Peace, feeling good, yeah? Connectivity with other people. Connected you with other people, that's great. What else? Yeah?
Deeply comforted.
Sorry?
Comforted.
Comfort?
Comfort.
Give you comfort, yes?
Escape from pain.
Escaping from pain. Great. Let's just take these. Escape from pain. sense of comfort, connectedness with other people, peace. Anything wrong with any of that? Aren't these normal human qualities, normal attributes that we all seek? In other words, number one, the addicted person just wants to feel like a normal being should feel. Number two, the addiction wasn't your problem. The addiction was your attempt to solve a problem. And the real problem is, why are we in so much pain? And how come you had no help with it? And why, with 7 billion people in the world, did you not feel connected to anyone? And why did you have so much stress and discomfort that you have to find comfort? Why did you feel so bad that you had to use an addictive outlet to feel good? These are life problems induced by life. So they're the primary problem. The addiction is just a response to it all. It's an attempt to cope with it. So to call it a primary disease of the brain is utter nonsense. And of course, it's even more nonsense to call it a choice, because who chooses to feel disconnected and to be in pain? So that's the second point. When we actually look at, so in other words, we need a totally different perspective. And you would think that after 100 years of the war on drugs, and Liz called it when she said it's a war on people, you don't make war on inanimate objects. There's no war on drugs. There's a war on people who are engaged with drugs. You think after 100 years, and you think after decades of all kinds of medical treatments and this, that, and the other, and look at the poor results we get, we would actually ask ourselves, what the heck is going on? Maybe our perspective isn't accurate. Maybe we need to have another look at this thing. Maybe the answer is not more of the same, or the same stuff but better done. Maybe we need to rethink our perspective. Well, that perspective has been available to us for 2,500 years. Because 2,500 years ago, the Buddha talked about what he called the interconnected co-arising of phenomena. He basically said everything is connected with everything else. He said, contemplate the nature of interconnected co-arising during every moment. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. And think of a leaf. It contains the sun, the light, the photosynthesis, the earth, the minerals, the sky, the water, the irrigation. The leaf contains the whole world. And we all do. And we're all connected in so many ways. And so the Buddha said, the birth and death of any phenomenon is connected to the birth and death of all phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. Without the many, there cannot be the one. In other words, we have to look at the whole picture. The modern scientific version of that perspective is what's called a biopsychosocial perspective, which simply points out that people's biology is inseparable from their psychology and their social circumstances. Let me give you a very simple example. A report last year showed that in the United States, if the more experiences of racism a black woman is subjected to, the greater the risk of asthma. A very simple correlation between a certain kind of stress and narrowing of your airways and inflammation in your lungs. Now, how do we treat asthma? To make a long story short, we treat it with stress hormones. That's how we treat it. Many other studies have shown that the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the child is to have asthma. Now, clearly, racism is a social phenomenon which affects the psychology, the emotional life of the individual. And that emotional life has an impact on the physiology of the individual. Now, I'm not going to go into the mechanics of what the connections are, except to say that that's the only way to understand human beings, that we're biopsychosocial creatures. Our biology is shaped by and affected by our emotional lives, which are conditioned by our social relationships and circumstances. So it doesn't matter what disease we're looking at or what condition we're looking at, including addiction, we have to look at the whole biopsychosocial picture. And what do we find when we look at specifically drug addiction, but really any addiction? A, that as we've demonstrated, it's an attempt to solve a problem. B, it's an attempt to feel like a normal human being is what it really is. And then the question is, why is it that people don't feel like normal human beings? Why is it that they need the addictive outlet or source or substance or behavior to regulate themselves so that they can feel okay? Well, that has to do with their circumstances, their emotional states, which are then conditioned by what happens to their families, which itself is conditioned by what happens in their society. So addiction is very much one of these phenomena where you have to look at the whole picture to understand what's happening to the individual. Now, what do we find when we look at populations of people who are addicted? And I don't care what they're addicted to, but especially hardcore substance users. What do we find? We find trauma upon trauma upon trauma, childhood trauma. That is the basis of all addiction. And in the downtown east side, where Liz and Mark and I worked all those years, I did not have a single female patient in 12 years who had not been sexually abused as a child. The men had been horrendously neglected or abused, which is also the finding in large-scale studies done in the United States, in Finland, in Alberta, Canada, that the more childhood adversity, the more childhood trauma, the greater the risk of addiction. Exponentially the greater. And it's not the case that everyone traumatized becomes addicted, but it is the case that everyone addicted was traumatized. There are other outcomes of trauma, heart disease being one of them, cancer being another. In a Canadian study, if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer is up by nearly 50%. This is regardless of whether you smoke or not. So we're looking at a biopsychosocial situation in any human condition. How is it that it drives addiction? How does trauma drive addiction? Well, first of all addictions, whether to gambling or to sex or to shopping or to substances, are about one thing primarily. It's an attempt to escape discomfort with the self. In other words, an attempt to escape pain or to soothe pain temporarily. So my mantra is not why the addiction, but why the pain. If you have to ask why the pain, you have to look at not people's genes, but people's lives. So that the trauma that people experience early in childhood then is a major source of pain. So that gives you the pain that you're then trying to soothe. That's the first point. The second point is that when the brilliant scientists at the National Institute on Drug Abuse do their brain scans and they think they've found the source of addiction in the brain, because they see abnormalities in the brain's reward circuitry and motivation and incentive circuitry and the self impulse regulation circuitry where you can stop yourself from doing something harmful because you got impulse regulation, and they find abnormalities in all these circuits. And they're looking at these scans where these abnormalities show up. We found the source of addiction in the brain. You know a simple little fact they're not looking at? The simple little fact that they're not looking at is that the brain itself is shaped by the environment. This is not even controversial scientifically. It's been published in major journals. But it's the biggest secret in medical life. There are two big secrets in medical life. 3. The more I think, the more secrets there are. But one secret is trauma. The average physician does not even hear the word trauma in all their years of education. Except maybe in psychiatry, where they learn about one specific condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is only one condition on the spectrum of trauma-induced mental problems. But they don't even hear the word. Secondly, they learn nothing about brain development. Astonishingly enough, brain being the organ that governs human behavior, we learn nothing about how it actually develops. Well, it turns out the brain develops in interaction with the environment. And the important circuits in the brain that are implicated in addiction and found to be abnormal on brain scans of addicts are actually shaped by the environment in the early years, beginning in the uterus. So the more stress a pregnant woman endures, the greater the risk of her child having mental health issues that predispose to addictions. And the more you stress laboratory animals, the more likely it is that their offspring will use cocaine and alcohol when they grow up to be adults, to soothe themselves. I'm talking about rats in the laboratory, or monkeys. So the brain is shaped by the environment. What is the most important element in the environment that actually shapes the brain? You know what the most important element is? According to an article in the journal Pediatrics, official journal of the American Pediatric Association, written, prepared by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. You couldn't get more prestigious than that. That's just what drives me up a tree about medical practice. We keep talking about evidence-based practice. We keep not looking at the evidence. So the most important quality in the environment that shapes the development of the circuits that are implicated in mental health issues and addictions and behavior and learning problems is the quality of adult-child relationships. And in fact, healthy brain development requires the mutual responsiveness of the adult child, but that fundamentally demands that the adult be responsive to the emotional needs and states of the child. And anything that interferes with that interferes with the development of these crucial brain circuits. Which is to say that the necessary condition for healthy brain development is the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. And anything that interferes with the parent's capacity to provide those qualities to their kids will actually impair and imperil the child's brain development. And if you're looking at why the preponderance of diagnoses of all kinds of childhood disorders, from ADHD to ODD to conduct disorders and anxiety and depression, anxiety being the fastest growing diagnosis amongst young people today, it's because the parenting environment, for no fault of individual parents, has become so stressed that an attuned, non-stressed interaction is rarely available anymore to our kids. Now add to that conditions of racism, conditions of poverty. What do you got? You got the toxic soup in which the brain just cannot attain its optimal development. You can take infant monkeys and measure the level of brain dopamine being an important incentive reward chemical that's implicated in all addictions, whether substance or behavior. You can measure the dopamine levels of these monkeys, separate them from the mothers, and a week later it goes way down after separation from mother. What are we doing when we separate infants from their mothers because we make the mother go to work 6 weeks after the baby is born? We're interfering with the child's dopamine circuitry development. You can do electroencephalograms. It's been done on the infants of 6-month-old babies whose mother had postpartum depression. And you can compare them with the EEGs of infants whose mothers are not depressed, and you can tell from the infant's EEG whose mother is depressed and who isn't. Now, in a society where postpartum depression's rate are reaching up to 20%, what are the implications? You can measure the cortisol, the stress hormone level of children, and at 3 years of age, if your mother was depressed, your cortisol levels are still likely to be elevated. In other words, you can't regulate your stresses very well, which means you're more likely to be addicted because addiction is a way of regulating stress. So, first, trauma gives you that pain that you're trying to escape all your life. Secondly, it shapes the brain in ways that makes it susceptible to addictive behaviors. Thirdly, the Buddha said very wisely that everything has thoughts in the lead. In other words, what we think guides our behaviors. So fundamentally what he's saying is that with our minds we create the world. So however I see the world, that's the world I'm living in. So if I see the world as a horrible place, I'm living in a very different world than somebody who thinks that the world is full of potential. It's beautiful and painful. It's nourishing and it can be dangerous. But there is all kinds of possibilities in it. Those two people live in a different world. Now there's somebody who said in these words, the world is a horrible place. That person is president of the United States right now. And that tells us, but what the Buddha didn't say is that before with our worlds we create with our minds we create the world. Before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. That's the task of modern psychology. And so Freud, who was the founder of modern psychiatry and psychology, in his very first paper saw it very, very clearly. His very first paper said that the root of mental illness is childhood trauma, because he interviewed these women and they're all being sexually abused by their fathers or close relatives. This was in 1895. And then he scared himself. Polite Viennese society was not ready to receive the news that children were being sexually abused. And Freud himself became scared of the implications of his findings, so then he came up with these cockamamie theories that these children were fantasizing sex with their fathers. And he just went right off the rails. But his fundamental insight, first of all, that adult behavior is really influenced by early childhood experiences, and is first to the subconscious, and that trauma was at the basis of that all, was quite accurate, if only he had stood by his own experience and findings. So when somebody says that the world is a horrible place, and that's the world he lives in, well, the world first created that mind. And if you look at the President of the United States, he's a deeply traumatized person. He had a rageaholic, workaholic father who demeaned and attacked his children at every turn. One brother died of alcoholism. The other one became a poweraholic and a profitaholic and a sexaholic and everything else. Except those are respectable in our society, respectable enough that now he gets to be in a position where he's imposing his own trauma on the whole world. And that's what's going on right now. But trauma creates your worldview. Fourthly, trauma induces shame. Because when a child either is badly treated or simply not treated well enough, and here I have to make a distinction for you. When we talk about trauma, we usually think about terrible things that happen. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and death of a parent, violence in a family, and so on. Well, those are traumatic, all right. But if you were growing plants in your backyard and they weren't developing properly, or I'm sorry, let me put it this way. If plants were growing in your backyard, there are two ways you could hurt them. You could hurt them by poisoning them or cutting them, but you could also hurt them by simply denying them what they need. Irrigation, minerals, sunlight. Same with children. They can be hurt, traumatized, not only by bad things happening, but by good things not happening. And in our society, that's increasingly the case, again, because of the stress on the parenting environment. And the breakdown of the connections in our society, as was mentioned in that video, where people are still in interaction, people are supportive, people are communal, that's human nature. We now live in a society that denies the most basic needs of human nature. And so a lot of children are being hurt, not by what happens that shouldn't have, but by what doesn't happen that should have. Well, whether the child experiences things that shouldn't happen, or whether he or she is simply denied the experiences that should occur, children are narcissistic. And I don't mean in a pejorative sense. I mean in a very specific technical sense, that they take everything personally. So when good things happen, and they're surrounded by laughter and joy and response, they'll believe they're pretty good people, worth loving, worthwhile, likable. Obversely, when bad things happen or those good things don't happen, the child assumes there's something wrong with me. So there's a deep shame that is ingrained as a result of your needs not being met or being actually trampled upon. That belief that there's something wrong with me is actually a coping mechanism. How would that be a coping mechanism? Well, the alternative is for the child to believe that the parents are incompetent, or unloving, or deliberately hurtful. A child cannot live with that. So to believe, therefore, that there's something is wrong with me is a coping mechanism. The problem is that those early coping mechanisms become the basis of our personality. And now you grow up thinking, there's something wrong with me, and there's a deep shame at the core. And then you start behaving in ways, as a result of that society disapproves of, and you're going to keep getting the message, yes, you should be ashamed of yourselves. Yes, you should be ashamed of yourselves. Yes, you should be ashamed of your very self. So trauma then induces that shame that people are then trying to somehow cover up or escape from. And of course, addictive behaviors, as I can tell you personally, because when you're addicted, and I have been, you lie and you cheat and you are out of integrity. So there's all kinds of reasons why you should feel ashamed of yourself, and you think you're feeling ashamed because of what you've done. No, the basic shame is simply because of what happened to you before you had any choice in the matter. And the other shames are simply superimposed on that original shame, and society makes bloody sure that that shame never escapes you. These are some of the impacts of trauma. Then, what trauma does is it makes it difficult for you to be in the present moment, because the past lives in you in a very negative way, and you're always triggered into reliving the past. I'll give you a very simple example. So I'm 73 years old now. When I was young and stupid at age 71, 2 years ago, I arrived home from a speaking trip. And the plane landed in Vancouver, and I was feeling really good about myself because it was a good trip and a good flight home. And my wife, Ray, my partner for 50 years now, was to have picked me up at the airport. When the plane lands, I get a text message saying, "I'm still at home, you still want me to come?" My response was a terse, "Never mind." And I was subjected to the indignity of having to take a cab all the way home. And when I get home, I walk in the house, I'm barely looking at her, and I'm very tense, and I'm that way for 24 hours. At the end of which time, Ray says, finally, "Knock it off already." At 71, I was mature enough that I could not knock it off after 24 hours. Years before, or decades before, it might have taken me weeks or months before I could knock it off. But now, I was progressed enough along the way that I could, okay, I'll knock it off. But what was that all about? My wife's an artist. She paints. Painters, artists, when they get into their game, forget all about time. Forget about the clock. They forget that they have to eat. They forget that they have to pee. They just are totally engaged in what they're doing. I knew that. That's all that happened. But 70 years before that, when I was 1 year old, my mother had given me to a stranger in the street in wartime Hungary to save my life. And I didn't see her for a month. Now, I don't recall that, because there's no recall for what happens to you at 1 year. But I remember it. Because there's a memory much more powerful than recall memory. Recall memory gives you the facts and the episodes, but the implicit memory, the emotional memory, brings up the feeling of what it's like to be abandoned. And when something happens in the present that reminds you of that, even vaguely, even in a very minor way, when you get triggered, then that emotion comes back with full force, and you think you're reacting to the present when you're actually living in the past. Think of the word trigger. When you look at any kind of a weapon, the trigger is a very small part of the mechanism. The bigger part is the machinery and the ammunition and the explosives. So the trigger can be very small, but the explosion will be huge. That's the past showing up. So trauma makes it hard for people to be in the present. They keep reacting to situations as if they're still living in the past. And when the past is that hurtful, as is the case of all substance users, then they're always living in a world where they're being hurt over and over and over again, or at least they're perceiving that they're being hurt. And so then when it comes to caregivers, what is their first experience of caregivers? The first experience of caregivers is that caregivers are not to be trusted. In fact, they're to be mistrusted. And then caregivers, like medical personnel and authority figures in general, make sure to validate that perception because of how we treat addicts. So when doctors or nurses speak to you in an impatient and stressed and demeaning way, when policemen address you in a hostile manner, when people shun looking at you, you get to relive your worst nightmare of being a child who was treated that way. So, and I could go on about the impacts of trauma, but you can see how it actually shows up in people's lives. And so, this is where harm reduction becomes so important, because harm reduction actually, as I said earlier, subverts all that. Harm reduction says, no, you're not worthless. Harm reduction says, no, you're not unlovable. Harm reduction says, no, you're not deficient, you're not less than anybody else, just as you saw in that film. So that's why I say that harm reduction is not just a technique, it's not just a set of practices. It's actually an attitude, it's a way of being, it's a whole approach. And it's contrary and subversive of, in the most healthiest sense of that word, of social attitudes. Now, let me read you a paragraph here from my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and copies of which, by the way, are available for purchase as a fundraiser for this organization, and I'm happy to sign them for you afterwards, should you wish that. But I'll read you a paragraph here. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's Sex Crimes Unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. As the Global Mail newspaper reported, on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors he witnessed. Quote, Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. Quote, they're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in his pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Those dead eyes represent nothing but escape. They represent the unbearable nature of what they're experiencing. But that's not the point I want to make. The point I want to is this. If that same compassionate and very dedicated cop had transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the street? The same kids that he didn't rescue. So when I talk about the arbitrariness of it all, think about it. We do our not very good best to protect and rescue children from that kind of abuse. But when we fail to do so, and later they soothe their pain with certain substances, then they become object of persecution. And that's the so-called war on drugs. And so again, any practice that is brave enough and compassionate enough and forward-looking enough to take the opposite attitude is a practice to be nurtured and cherished and emulated. Now, I'll say one more thing before I take questions. There are many myths around drug addiction and addiction in general. One of them which is that people only learn from negative consequences, so let's impose negative consequences on people, which we do with great efficiency. When you think about recovery, the word recovery itself is a telling phrase, because to recover something is to find it again. Now, if you're finding something again, then it must never have been destroyed in the first place. Otherwise, you couldn't find it again. So those of you that recovered, what did you find again? Anybody? Anybody here recovered? What did you find? Sorry? What did you find? You? Is that what you said? Yeah, you find yourself. That's what people often say. So that true self is underneath it all, and that's never been destroyed. But you lost sight of it. And then you recovered it. You found it again through the work that you did in dealing with your trauma and dealing with your addiction. Now, what is it that people need to recover themselves? I'm going to quote you the words of Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monk and spiritual teacher. And he said, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some confidence. It's not negative consequences that we need. It's just the opposite. Addicts have had every kind of negative consequence. If living in the street with HIV outside the law is not hitting rock bottom, then what the hell is? And if hitting rock bottom is what people need to do, why haven't they recovered? It's not because they haven't hit rock bottom, it's because they see no possibility of anything else, because we haven't offered them any other possibility. So Merton says, in order to gain possession of ourselves, we have to have some confidence, some hope of victory. And in order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. Now, to a person who began life, maybe in the uterus, with a highly stressed mother, and he was bombarded with stress hormones from the moment that he became a one-celled organism to the time that he was born. And then he's born into a circumstance where multi-generational trauma, and trauma is multi-generational. It's passed on from one cohort to another, not because anybody wishes to, because that's just how it works. So when the Bible says that the sins of the father are visited upon unto the seventh generation, if you just substitute trauma for sin, you've got a very accurate description of what happens. And so if we're seeing, when I was speaking in Chicago on Thursday, somebody asked me, is there such a thing as post-slavery stress disorder? Well, there actually is. Although you have to say that if slavery was the only problem, then that would have ended in 1865 or 66, whenever Lincoln outlawed slavery. But of course, it's not just the direct effects of slavery, it's also the ongoing impact, for example, of discrimination, economic, political, and legal, that I surely don't have to tell you about. That is as much a reality now as it was decades ago. So trauma is multi-generational, and the more we traumatize each new generation, the more we create mental health problems, addiction, and other issues in the future. And if you want to look at North America's most traumatized population, they also happen to be the most addicted population, which is our Aboriginal people, the native populations, both in my country and in yours, who were genocidally exterminated, who were robbed of their lands and livelihood and spiritual ways, who had access to potentially addictive substances, like tobacco and peyote, for example, before the coming of the Caucasians, but amongst whom there was no addiction whatsoever until they were traumatized, which shoots the hell out of the genetic theories right then and there. But now, of course, given that the children were actually abducted from them, at least in my country for 100 years, forced to live in residential schools where they couldn't see their parents, and on top of which they were sexually and physically abused, generation after generation. Now you've got a deeply entrenched trauma culture. And that happens to be the reason why First Nations people make up 4% of Canada's population, but they make up 30% of the jail population. Or in the downtown east side, where Liz and Mark and I did our work, 25-30% of our clients were First Nations origin. So, if what people need is not defeat but victory to recover themselves, to find themselves, how does that victory show up? Well, it's a victory if you can walk into a place and they treat you like a human being. It's a victory if you walk into a place and they say, this is where you're at in life, we get it. You're okay by us. You don't have to explain anything, justify anything, give up anything, change in any way. Just who you are is really okay with us. Well, that person can experience a twinge of victory. Hey, maybe I'm okay. And the more of that, the more okayness they can experience, the better their chances are of recovery, of finding their true selves. Now, even if they don't, it's a total myth that abstinence is the only legitimate outcome of treatment. At the Portland Hotel, as Liz told me many years ago, it's a victory and a success, not if somebody gives up the drugs, but if somebody comes in to get their abscess bandaged. If they come to take their HIV medications, whereas before they didn't, because they didn't trust their caregivers enough and didn't care about themselves enough to do so. That's victory enough. So, harm reduction does not need to have any other purpose than to give people that little taste of victory. Where it leads to is not up to us, but that we should provide it is our duty. Thank you very much.